There are few surnames in Bengal's history as politically charged as Suhrawardy. Mention the name today, and most people think of one man, Huseyn Shaheed Suhrawardy, the last premier of undivided Bengal, the man who presided over Bengal in the months leading to partition, the man whose name in India, at least, remains inseparable from Direct Action Day and the communal violence that engulfed Calcutta in August 1946. For decades, that association has shaped how an entire generation remembers the name Suhrawardy. It also turns out to be only part of the story, because the latest political controversy in West Bengal begins with a historical error. When the state announced 2 weeks back that Kolkata Suhrawardy Avenue would be renamed after Gopal Mukherjee, the move was presented as the removal of Huseyn Suhrawardy's legacy from the city's streets. Except the avenue was never named after him. It was named after another Suhrawardy altogether, his uncle, Lieutenant Colonel Sir Hassan Suhrawardy. One of the most useful books for anyone interested in Kolkata's forgotten histories is P. Thankappan Nair's A History of Calcutta Streets. It's because of painstaking work like this that we know that the avenue was named after Sir Hassan Suhrawardy in 1933. Hassan Suhrawardy was a surgeon, a public health administrator, the first Muslim Vice-Chancellor of the University of Calcutta, and a man who died months before Direct Action Day of 1946. That single historical detail transforms what appears to be a contemporary political controversy into something much larger. This is not the story of a road or a politician. It's the story of one of Bengal's most remarkable Muslim families, a family whose members helped build universities, hospitals, courts, and cultural institutions across the subcontinent before one man's political career came to eclipse almost everyone else who shared his surname. Before we come to Huseyn Suhrawardy, we need to understand the family he came from. In the first half of the 20th century, being a Suhrawardy did not automatically mean being a politician. The family's reputation had been built through scholarship, medicine, law, and public service. Their story begins in a classroom with Ubaidullah al-Ubaidi Suhrawardy. If Bengal's 19th century produced a generation of reformers who believed education could transform Indian society, Ubaidullah belonged firmly among them. Born in 1832, he lived through one of the most turbulent periods in the history of British India. The revolt of 1857 had altered the relationship between the colonial state and India's Muslims. Questions on education, representation, and social mobility had acquired an urgency they had never possessed before. It was in this atmosphere that Ubaidullah emerged as an influential scholar of Arabic and Persian and later became the first superintendent of the Dhaka Madrasa in 1874. Unlike many traditional scholars of his generation, he did not see Islamic learning and Western education as competing worlds. His writings ranged across Arabic, Persian, and English, reflecting a belief that intellectual renewal required engagement with both traditions. If you'd like to understand the Bengal Muslim intellectual renaissance and where families like the Suhrawardis came from, Muhammad Majlum Khan's The Muslim Heritage of Bengal is an excellent place to begin. Majlum Khan describes Ubaidullah as belonging to a wider movement of Muslim reformers in Bengal who sought to arrest the decline of Islamic scholarship while preparing Muslims for the demands of a changing colonial society. Education became the Suhrawardy family's inheritance and public institutions became their arena. Within a few decades, the Suhrawardis had produced physicians, judges, educationists, legislators, and scholars whose influence extended far beyond Bengal. This is where the story becomes particularly striking. The family did not produce just one well-known politician, it produced an entire generation. Ubaidullah's daughter, Khujista Akhtar Banu, became one of Bengal's earliest educated Muslim women and later married Justice Sir Zahid Suhrawardy of the Calcutta High Court. Their household produced two sons whose lives took entirely different directions. The elder, Hassan Shahid Suhrawardy, became an art critic, writer, and international intellectual. Educated at Oxford, he moved comfortably through artistic circles in Europe, wrote on aesthetics, introduced the works of artist Jamini Roy to wider audiences, and maintained friendships with literary figures such as D.H. Lawrence. Another member of the family, Abdullah Al-Mamun Suhrawardy, became one of Bengal's earliest doctoral scholars and later served in the Bengal Legislative Council. Then there was Hassan Suhrawardy. Trained as a surgeon, he rose through the Indian Medical Service, became the Chief Medical Officer of the Eastern Bengal Railway, helped establish the East London Mosque and, in 1930, became the first Muslim VC of the University of Calcutta. He was also knighted in 1932. So, when Calcutta Corporation decided to name a new avenue after him in 1933, the decision attracted little controversy. At the moment, Hassan Suhrawardy was among the most distinguished public figures in Bengal. Nobody could have imagined that within little more than a decade, another member of the same family would so thoroughly redefine what the surname Suhrawardy meant. And unlike the rest of his family, Huseyn Suhrawardy chose politics. There is also a biography written by Huseyn Suhrawardy's cousin, Begum Saishta Suhrawardy Ikramullah, offering a fascinating window into how the family saw him. Now, Hussein's decision to enter politics would go on to alter how generations of Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis would remember the Suhrawardy name. His political journey, surprisingly, did not begin with the Muslim League. It started with Chittaranjan Das. If you want to read a little more on Bengal's politics in the 1920s and 30s, historian Joya Chatterjee's Bengal Divided remains one of the most important books on why communal politics eventually overtook provincial nationalism. Now, after returning from Oxford, Hussain briefly practiced law in Calcutta. But the city was also emerging as the epicenter of anti colonial politics, and one leader in particular captured the imagination of young lawyers and students alike. Chittaranjan Das. Das believed that the nationalist movement could not succeed unless Bengal's Hindus and Muslims found common political ground. His answer was the Bengal Pact of 1923. The agreement proposed greater representation for Muslims in government employment and local bodies, acknowledging that while Bengal's Muslims formed a demographic majority, they remained underrepresented in education and colonial bureaucracy. For Huseyn Suhrawardy, the Bengal Pact was an attempt to reconcile nationalism with the political aspirations of Bengal's Muslims. He joined Das's Swaraj Party, of which Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was also a member, and entered public life at a moment when cooperation seemed possible. That moment did not last. The death of Chittaranjan Das in 1925 fundamentally altered Bengal's political landscape. The Swaraj Party lost its unifying figure, communal tension sharpened, and many Muslim politicians began searching for organizations that spoke more directly to Muslim political interests. Huseyn Suhrawardy was one of them. He gravitated first towards the Central National Mohammedan Association and later towards the All India Muslim League. And it was not just a change of party. Historian Chandrachud Ghosh, who has written extensively on Bengal's late colonial politics, argues that it reflected a deeper ideological shift. The 1930s transformed Huseyn from a lawyer into one of Bengal's most influential politicians. The Government of India Act of 1935 granted provincial autonomy and introduced elections that gave politicians unprecedented authority over provincial governments. In Bengal, however, the results produced neither stability nor clarity. The province was too socially and politically diverse for any one party to govern alone. This was the Bengal of large zamindars and indebted peasants and of Calcutta's industrial elite and the cultivators of East Bengal. There were competing religious identities, but also competing economic interests. At the center of this new political landscape stood A.K. Fazlul Haq and the Krishak Praja Party. Founded in 1936, the party sought to represent Bengal's rural cultivators, many of whom felt ignored by both the Congress and the Muslim League. The elections that followed produced an uneasy coalition between the Krishak Praja Party and the Muslim League. It was within this coalition that Huseyn Suhrawardy came into his own. He developed a reputation as one of the League's most capable organizers, an administrator who understood both the machinery of government and the arithmetic of electoral politics. Over the next decade, his influence expanded steadily. He served as the civil supplies minister during the Bengal famine, a period that remains one of the most darkest chapters in the province's history. Historians continue to debate the extent of responsibility borne by individual ministers, the colonial administration, and wartime policies, but the famine permanently altered the Bengal's political climate and intensified criticism of the provincial government. By the mid-1940s, Huseyn had also become one of Muhammad Ali Jinnah's most trusted lieutenants in Bengal. Then came the election of 1946. The Muslim League won an overwhelming mandate in Bengal's Muslim constituencies. At 53, Huseyn Suhrawardy became the Premier of Bengal. It should have been the culmination of Huseyn's 2 decades in politics. Instead, it became the beginning of a legacy from which his name has never escaped. Within months of taking office, Bengal stood on the edge of partition. The cabinet mission plan had collapsed, negotiations between the Congress and the Muslim League had broken down. The Muslim League announced that 16 August 1946 would be observed as Direct Action Day. The purpose, it said, was to demonstrate Muslim support for Pakistan. What followed remains one of the darkest episodes in the history of Calcutta, and it also transformed the history of the Suhrawardy family. For 4 days, the city descended into extraordinary communal violence. Neighborhoods turned against one another, homes, shops, and places of worship were attacked. By the time the violence subsided, thousands had been killed and many more displaced. It became the first great bloodletting of partition. The question that has divided historians ever since is where the responsibility of the violence lied. No official transcript survives of Huseyn Suhrawardy's speech on the morning of 16th August. Some intelligence reports sent to the Viceroy are still there, but their contents and context have been reinterpreted over the years. Governor Frederick Burrows noted that two independent observers broadly agreed that Suhrawardy had suggested that the police and the military had been restrained from intervening. Burrows himself concluded that whatever Suhrawardy intended, those remarks could have easily been interpreted by the crowd as an open invitation to disorder. Criticism came swiftly. Among Hussein's fiercest opponents was Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. Speaking in the Bengal Legislative Assembly a month later, Mukherjee accused the provincial government of presiding over an administration that was inefficient, corrupt, and communal. Those accusations would remain attached to Suhrawardy for the rest of his life. Even today, it is this episode that dominates his memory in India. Yet history rarely moves in straight lines. Within months, the same man who had become synonymous with Direct Action Day proposed something that appears almost paradoxical. As partition became increasingly inevitable, Hussein joined hands with Sharat Chandra Bose to argue for an independent, undivided Bengal, a sovereign state that would remain outside both India and Pakistan. But by then, trust in Suhrawardy had collapsed. Many Hindu leaders believed the events of August 1946 had made such assurances impossible to accept. The Congress opposed the proposal and the Muslim League leadership remained committed to Pakistan. Within weeks, the idea of a sovereign Bengal disappeared and partition became inevitable. There is another episode from this period that receives far less attention, yet says much about the complexity of Suhrawardy. When India became independent on 15th August 1947, Gandhi was not in Delhi. He was in Beliaghata, one of the neighborhoods worst affected by communal violence in Calcutta, and he chose to stay under the same roof as Huseyn Suhrawardy. The Hindu has an excellent essay titled On August 15, 1947, Where Was Bapu? The essay reconstructs why Gandhi chose Calcutta instead of Delhi. Now, Gandhi's decision back then had shocked many. To his critics, it was almost incomprehensible that he would stay with a man whom many held responsible for the previous year's violence. Gandhi saw it differently. If peace was to mean anything, he believed reconciliation could not exclude those whose actions or inaction had become part of the tragedy. Together, Gandhi and Suhrawardy walked through riot-affected neighborhoods in Calcutta. They met Hindu and Muslim residents and appealed for calm. The experiment culminated in what later came to be known as the Calcutta Miracle, when the city largely remained peaceful around independence, even as Punjab descended into one of the worst episodes of mass violence in modern history. It is one of the great ironies of Huseyn Suhrawardy's life. The man whose name became inseparable from the violence of August 1946 also became one of Gandhi's partners in restoring communal peace less than a year later. As for Huseyn Suhrawardy's political career, it was not over yet despite the larger sentiment. After partition, he crossed a newly created border, and in Pakistan, he would begin an entirely different political life. At the time, Pakistan was barely a state. It had a constitution to write, institutions to build, and two geographically separated wings, East and West Pakistan, that differed in language, economy, and political priorities. For Suhrawardy, this was also an opportunity to begin again. Unlike many politicians whose careers effectively ended with partition, he quickly re-established himself in Pakistan's turbulent politics. The challenge, however, was entirely different from the one he had confronted in Bengal. Although East Pakistan accounted for the majority of the country's population, power rested largely in Karachi and increasingly within the military and the civil bureaucracy. Suhrawardy repeatedly argued that Pakistan could survive only if its democratic institutions reflected that demographic reality. His speeches from the period reveal a politician preoccupied with elections and governance. In 1956, Pakistan's President Sikandar Mirza invited him to form the government. History, once again, offered an irony. Mirza is widely acknowledged to have been the descendant of Mir Jafar, the man whose name in India has become synonymous with betrayal after he gave up Bengal's last Nawab, Siraj-ud-Daulat, in the Battle of Plassey. Nearly 2 centuries later, one of Mir Jafar's descendants appointed one of Bengal's most consequential politicians as Prime Minister of Pakistan. Suhrawardy's tenure lasted barely a year. Coalition governments proved unstable. The presidency and the military increasingly asserted themselves over elected politicians in Pakistan. Yet, throughout this period, Suhrawardy remained consistent on one point. He believed Pakistan's future depended upon parliamentary democracy. Writing in Foreign Affairs in 1957, Suhrawardy rejected the suggestion that Pakistan was somehow unsuited to democratic government and urged for elections. It was a conviction that would ultimately place him at odds with the country's emerging military establishment. In October 1958, President Mirza imposed martial law. Within days, he himself was removed by the army chief, General Ayub Khan. If you want to know about how Pakistan's military viewed civilian politicians like Suhrawardy, Ayub Khan's autobiography, Friends Not Masters, remains an important source, even if you don't agree with all of his conclusions. Now, after this, Pakistan's first experiment with parliamentary democracy came to an abrupt end. Suhrawardy, once Prime Minister, now found himself under surveillance, periodically detained, and eventually disqualified from politics. He left Pakistan and spent his final years abroad. He died in Beirut, Lebanon in December 1963. Now, decades after his death, the Suhrawardy name has once again entered Bengal's vocabulary. If the proposed renaming is implemented, Suhrawardy Avenue will become Gopal Mukherjee Road, which means one of the most contested political figures associated with the Great Calcutta Killings will give way to another figure remembered very differently. To many Hindus, Gopal Mukherjee or Gopal Patha is remembered as a man who organized the defense of Hindu neighborhoods when communal violence engulfed Calcutta. His family continues to describe him as someone who protected vulnerable civilians and refused to target the innocent. Historians offer a more complicated assessment. They place him within the wider cycle of retaliatory violence that followed the initial attacks, arguing that the riots quickly became a tragedy in which no community escaped suffering. Historian Ramchandra Guha has pointed out that although the violence began with the Muslim League's direct action mobilization, Muslims ultimately suffered the greater loss of life and property in Calcutta because they were outnumbered once the violence spread.
Historians are pointing out that the Kolkata street, now renamed after Gopal Mukherjee, was in fact not named on Huseyn Suhrawardy, the butcher of Bengal. Instead, it was named after Hassan Suhrawardy, his maternal uncle, who was the first Muslim Vice-Chancellor of Calcutta University. Now, there are also some historians who are pointing out that the Kolkata street was initially named neither on Huseyn nor on Hassan Suhrawardy, but their ancestor Maulana Suhrawardy. Whatever the case may be, what is interesting to me is that Gopal Mukherjee, on whom the Kolkata street is now named, has been picked up from the dustbin of history after all these years. Now, Gopal Mukherjee has been variously described as a gunda, a gangster, and as the savior of Calcutta's Hindus. His role in the 1946 Great Calcutta Killings has not been talked about once India gained independence as much perhaps as it should have been. Now, he's a contested figure. Some look at him as a bigot, as a communal man who killed a lot of Muslims during the Great Calcutta Killings. But I have had the opportunity not just to talk to his family, but also to some of the survivors of the 1946 Great Calcutta Killings who told me that had it not been for Gopal Mukherjee, Calcutta would have not been a part of India, as was allegedly the plan of Suhrawardy. In fact, after the Great Calcutta Killings in Calcutta, in August 1946, communal violence spread to Noakhali, which is now in Bangladesh. And while writing my book, Being Hindu in Bangladesh, I traveled to Noakhali and I spoke to some of the Hindu families there whose ancestors survived the Noakhali riots. And it's interesting what they told me. They told me, had there been a Gopal Mukherjee at that time in Noakhali, they would not have had to witness the horrors that they did during the Noakhali riots. The question is, yes, there is a debate and a controversy over which Suhrawardy the Calcutta street was named, but after all these years, in 2026, Gopal Mukherjee is back as a name in Calcutta again, now a street.
The controversy over Suhrawardy Avenue began with a mistaken identity, but it eventually leads to a much larger question. How do societies remember complicated people? The Suhrawardis produced scholars, judges, physicians, diplomats, artists, and educationists across three generations. Yet, for most people today, the surname evokes only one individual. That is perhaps the greatest irony of the Suhrawardi family's history.
I think I'm not really surprised with this whole Suravadi debate and this needless controversy. The point is that whenever BJP comes into power in any state, the first thing it does is to change the names of cities, change the name of roads, change the name of avenues, and I think it's a diversionary tactic. Where are the policies that we can look forward to all citizenry? That is, cleanliness, jobs for all, employment, better healthcare. I think we look forward to those policies, right? And here, I think the BJP is using this whole name change narrative to polarize society, and it's a very, very tragic part. I mean, I don't care, who the father or the nephew was. But the fact is that at one point of time they did some good work. That is the reason uh, avenue was named after them. But the point is that BJP wants to take us to the past and make villains out of every historical character. And I think it's time to look forward because 2026